He didn't look at my father when he said it. That was the thing I noticed first. Not the words, not the way the room went quiet, not even my father's hand landing on my shoulder like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had already been decided. Garrett looked at me, just for a second. Then his jaw tightened and he looked away, and I understood something in that moment that I wouldn't be able to explain until much later. My name is Sonia. I'm 31 years old, and I spent most of my life being the wrong kind of daughter. Not the rebellious kind. I want to be clear about that. I didn't drink, didn't drop out, didn't come home with tattoos, or bad boyfriends, or a philosophy degree. I did everything right, actually. I got good grades. I kept my room clean. I said please and thank you and yes, Dad, until those words wore grooves in the back of my throat. I joined the Canadian Armed Forces at 22 because I believed in something, and also, if I'm being honest with myself the way I've only recently learned to be, because I thought it might finally make him proud. It didn't. Nothing did. That was the thing about my father, Clifford, that took me almost 3 decades to understand. The problem was never what I did or didn't do. The problem was that I was the wrong child. My sister Blythe had been the right one since before either of us could walk, and no amount of achievement on my part was ever going to change the math. Blythe is 2 years younger than me, beautiful in the way that makes strangers stop mid-sentence, and she has never once, in her entire life, been asked to justify her existence at the dinner tables. She didn't join anything. She didn't serve anything. And she waitressed for a while after high school, then got a job at a marketing firm in Calgary, and my father speaks about her career the way other men speak about their children's medical degrees. I was based out of Esquimalt on Vancouver Island when Blythe called to tell me she was engaged. I was genuinely happy for her. I want to say that without caveats because I think people expect me to say it through gritted teeth and then admit I wasn't really. But I was. She sounded so light on the phone, laughing in the middle of sentences, and I thought, good, you deserve this. We both deserved good things, even if our family had never operated on that principle. His name is Garrett, she said. Garrett Vance. He's, okay, don't freak out. He's a master warrant officer, like actual military. I laughed. I know what a master warrant officer is. Right, obviously. Sorry, a pause. He's with JTF 2. I didn't say anything for a moment. Joint Task Force 2, Canada's Tier 1 Special Operations Unit. The quiet ones. The ones whose deployments don't make the news, whose names don't appear in press releases, who do the work that most people in this country never hear about and probably wouldn't believe if they did. Okay, I said carefully. He sounds serious. He is, she said. He's the most serious person I've ever met. You're going to love him. She paused again, and I heard something shift in her voice. Something more careful. Dad wants to do a family dinner when you can come. He wants to meet Garrett properly. I stared at the water outside my window. The strait was flat and gray that afternoon, the kind of gray that looks like it's thinking. Sure, I said. I'll come. I should tell you where I was at that point in my career because it matters for the rest of this, and because I didn't tell Blythe. I hadn't told anyone in my family, actually. Not the specifics. My father knew I was an officer. He knew I'd been promoted a few times. He never asked beyond that, and I'd stopped volunteering information years ago, somewhere around the 3rd time he'd responded to news of my advancement, by pivoting immediately to something Blythe had done that week. I was, at that point, a lieutenant colonel. I was also, for reasons I'm still not entirely at liberty to detail, serving in a secondment role that put me in rooms with people who had significantly more stars on their shoulders than I did. I had clearances that required their own clearances to discuss. I had spent the previous 8 months doing work that I found genuinely important, The kind of work that kept me awake not from stress, but from a sense of, I don't know how to say this without sounding like a recruitment poster, purpose. None of that existed in my father's kitchen in Red Deer. In my father's kitchen, I was still the daughter who'd left and never quite come back right. The dinner was on a Saturday in late October. I drove up from Calgary. I'd flown into the city the day before and stayed with a friend. And I remember the highway being mostly empty. The fields on either side already harvested down to stubble, that particular Alberta autumn light that's gold and a little brutal at the same time. My mother, Pauline, had died when Blythe and I were teenagers. Cancer, fast, the kind that doesn't give you time to say the things you meant to say. After that, it was just us and Clifford had responded to grief by getting harder, more exacting, more certain that the world owed him something that it kept failing to deliver. I think losing her broke something in him that he never found words for. I think he took that breakage out on whoever was closest, and I happened to be the child who stood still long enough to absorb it. Blythe learned early to deflect, to smile and change the subject and keep things smooth. I was always the one who pushed back, who asked why, who sat across from him at dinner and refused to look away first. He never forgave me for that. People like my father don't. Blythe's car was already in the driveway when I got there, and beside it, a dark blue pickup truck. Alberta plates, clean, the kind of truck that doesn't announce itself. I sat in my own car for a moment before going in. Not from nerves, exactly. More like the way you pause before re-entering a space that has a specific gravity to it, one that pulls you back into older, smaller versions of yourself without asking permission. Inside, the house smelled like pot roast and my father's particular brand of woodsy aftershave. Blythe came to the front hall to meet me, hugging me hard, whispering, "You look amazing," into my shoulder. She looked radiant in the way that newly engaged people sometimes do, like something inside had been turned up a notch. "He's in the living room with Dad," she said quietly. "It's going okay. Dad likes him." Of course, Dad likes him, I thought. Dad likes men who've done things he can understand. I walked in. My father was sitting in his chair. He's always in the chair, the big recliner he's had since 1994 that we were never allowed to sit in as kids. And across from him, on the couch, was Garrett Vance. Garrett was not what I expected, which is to say he was exactly what JTF2 tends to produce. Compact, watchful, the kind of still that isn't passive but is instead the result of a person who has learned to conserve themselves for when it counts. He had dark eyes and a steady face, and when I walked in he stood up, automatically, no hesitation, and reached out to shake my hand. "Sanja," Blythe said. "Nice to meet you," I said. Something happened in his face when I came through the doorway, a very small thing. The way his posture shifted, a degree, maybe two, and his eyes moved with a kind of focus that felt professional. He took my hand, held it for exactly the right amount of time, and then he looked at me with an expression I recognized because I'd seen it in briefing rooms, recalibration. He had noticed something. I wasn't sure what yet. My father, because my father has never in his life let a moment arrive naturally, chose that precise second to perform. "And this," Clifford said, with the expansive gesture of a man who considers himself the narrator of every room he inhabits, "is my other daughter." He laughed, a little sound, dismissive in the precise way that things can be dismissive when they're dressed as jokes. "The families, well, Blythe's the one you've heard about, I'm sure. Sonya's in the military. Does her thing." He waved a hand. "She keeps herself busy." The room held a particular silence. Blythe looked at the floor. Garrett looked at my father, and then he looked back at me. "She keeps herself busy. 22 years of service. 4 deployments. 2 commendations. A posting that required a background check so extensive it took 8 months to complete. She keeps herself busy. I smiled. I've had a long time to practice smiling at my father's diminishments, long enough that the smile arrives before the hurt does, a kind of advance guard. "Good to meet you, Garrett," I said, and sat down. Dinner was the usual. Clifford talked about the property, about some dispute with a neighbor over a fence line, about the Oilers. He asked Garrett questions in the way that men of his generation ask other men questions, testing, ranking, establishing. Garrett answered everything simply and directly, without embellishment, which I could tell my father both respected and found slightly unreadable. At one point my father said, "So what exactly does your unit do? Blythe says you can't really talk about it." Garrett said, "That's mostly accurate." My father nodded slowly, the way he does when he's deciding whether to be impressed or annoyed. "Must be something, though. This serious stuff. It has its moments," Garrett said. Across the table, Blythe was refilling water glasses and carefully not making eye contact with anyone. She does this at family dinners, becomes a background figure, smoothing edges, keeping things from catching. It's how she survived growing up in this house. I don't blame her. I just chose a different way. After dinner, Blythe and I did the dishes while Clifford took Garrett out to the garage to show him something, his truck or his tools, or some other artifact of competence that my competence for the purpose of demonstrating it to people he's decided are worth demonstrating to. "He's good," I told Blythe at the sink. "I know," she said. Sanja, I really love him." "I can tell." She handed me a plate to dry. "Dad's been so much better tonight than I thought he'd be." I didn't say anything. "I know," she said quietly, reading my silence the way sisters do. "The other daughter thing. I'm sorry. It's fine. It's not, though." "No," I agreed. "It's not. But it's also Tuesday." She laughed a little, unhappily, and we finished the dishes. When we came back out, Clifford and Garrett were in the living room again. My father was in his chair. Garrett was standing by the bookcase, and there was something different in the room, a quality I couldn't quite locate at first. Garrett was looking at a photograph on the shelf, one of the few photographs my father keeps out, Blythe and me at some Christmas, years ago, and then some of Blythe at various stages, and one almost hidden behind the others of me in uniform. It was old. Lieutenant, at the time. The uniform was different from what I wear now, and the face was younger, but it was unmistakably me and unmistakably military. Garrett picked it up. Not rudely, carefully, the way you pick up something that belongs to someone else with the implicit acknowledgement that you're borrowing the contact. He studied it. Then he looked up at me. "How long ago was this?" he asked. "About 9 years," I said. "And you're still serving?" "Yes." Something moved across his face again, that recalibration. "What's your current posting?" he asked. It was a direct question, the kind that military people ask each other, clean, without social performance around it. My father looked vaguely confused by the directness of it. Blythe looked up from her phone. I told him, "Not all of it. There are things I don't say even in non-classified company, but enough. My rank, my current unit. 1 or 2 words about the nature of the work without the nature of the work." The room went very quiet, not the dinner table quiet of before, which had been the usual hum of avoidance. This was a different quality of quiet, the kind that happens when information lands and people don't yet know what to do with it. Garrett set the photograph down, slowly. He turned to face me fully, not the half-turned posture of casual conversation, but the full, squared attention of someone in a professional context. And then, with a naturalness that made it more startling than any dramatic gesture would have been, he said, "Ma'am." Just that, 1 word. And he held it. My father made a sound, not a word, more like the beginning of a word that didn't finish. Blythe's phone was no longer in her hands. Garrett's expression was completely neutral. He wasn't performing anything. He wasn't making a point, wasn't staging a moment for effect. He was simply a master warrant officer with JTF2 who had just correctly identified the rank of the woman standing across from him, and he was responding the way his training and his own integrity required him to respond. "Garrett," I said quietly, "we're at dinner. You're off the clock." "Yes, ma'am," he said. And then, almost, not quite, but almost, the corner of his mouth moved. My father said. Nobody answered him for a moment. Blythe said softly, "Sanja, why didn't you ever tell us?" "I told you I was in the military." "You didn't tell us." She stopped. Started again. "You're a lieutenant colonel, yes." "You work with." She glanced at Garrett. "Adjacents to," I said carefully. "That's about as much as I can say." Clifford had not much as from his chair. He was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, not in 31 years. It wasn't pride. Not exactly. It was something more unsettled than pride. Something that looked like a man encountering a version of a story he thought he knew and realizing he'd been reading it wrong. "You never said," he said. His voice had lost its performance quality. It sounded, suddenly, like an old man's voice. "You never asked," I said. It came out without heat. That was the thing. I'd had so many years to imagine this conversation happening with fire in it, with all the things I'd stored up and never said. But it just came out plain, the way true things sometimes do. "You never asked." He looked at his hands. The same hands that had waved me off at dinner all those years, that had gestured toward Blythe with that habitual ease of a man distributing his attention according to some private ledger I'd never been given access to. Garrett, with the impeccable timing of someone who has been trained to read rooms, said, "I could use some water if anyone's." Blythe laughed. Genuinely, the startled kind. "Yes. Yes. Let me." She was already moving toward the kitchen, grateful for the motion. Garrett caught my eye as Blythe passed him. He gave me a look that was professional in its discretion, but entirely human in its intent. "You all right?" I gave him the smallest nod. We stayed another hour. The conversation found its way back to normal things. The drive up, the weather coming in off the mountains, Blythe's plans for a spring wedding, whether they'd do it in Calgary or smaller. My father talked less than usual. He refilled his own glass twice and said, at one point, looking at the middle distance somewhere between me and the wall, "I didn't know it was like that." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I said, "I know you didn't." He nodded. That was the whole exchange. 2 sentences. I've turned them over probably 300 times since then, looking for more in them than was there, and I've made peace with the fact that 300 times is enough. Some conversations don't have the resolution you spent years rehearsing. Some of them are just 2 sentences and a nod and a room that has shifted by a few degrees and will stay shifted from now on. On the way out, Garrett shook my hand again. "Thank you for your service," he said, genuinely. I almost made a joke, the self-deprecating reflex that women in my position develop as armor, and then I didn't. I just said, "And you?" He smiled. A real one this time. "Blythe talks about you constantly, you know. She said you were the hardest person she'd ever tried to describe." "That tracks," I said. He laughed. It transformed his face. Blythe hugged me in the driveway, long and a little tight, the way she hugs when she doesn't have words. I felt her exhale into my shoulder. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for all the times I didn't, when he did that thing, and I just... Blythe, I should have said something. You were surviving," I said. "That's different." She pulled back and looked at me. Her eyes were bright. "You're not angry?" I thought about it, really considered the question, the way I rarely let myself do in real time. "I was," I said, "for a long time. I think I'm just tired of carrying it now." She nodded, and her face did something complicated and honest, and I loved her for not trying to smooth it. I drove back down to Calgary in the dark, the highway empty, the mountains a blacker shape against a black sky. I had my radio on low. Some CBC program about nothing in particular, voices talking about things that didn't matter, and I thought about that photograph on the shelf. The one my father kept but never talked about, the one that was almost hidden behind the others, but was still, after all those years, still there. He'd kept it. I hadn't known that before tonight. I don't know what it means, exactly. I'm not the kind of person who assigns easy meaning to things, but I drove home thinking about it. That photograph, half hidden on a shelf in Red Deer, and a man in his chair who said, "I didn't know it was like that," and the fact that, in 31 years, that might have been the most honest thing he ever said to me. It wasn't everything. I'm not going to pretend it was everything. But it was something. And sometimes something, after a very long time of nothing, is enough to breathe around. Garrett and Blythe are getting married in June. I'll be there. I'm not sure what my father and I are to each other now. Not repaired, not the way that word implies something whole and finished. More like two people who have agreed, without saying so, to try again in a different register. Slowly, without performance. I'll take it. And I've spent my career learning that most worthwhile things don't arrive the way you imagined them. They arrive smaller, plainer, with less music than you expected. They arrive in driveways in October, and two-sentence conversations, and old photographs on shelves. You learn to recognize them anyway,